Fresh from Jesus preaching fire and brimstone, guess what we get today? A miraculous healing. I don't know which is more difficult to preach about, the hard sayings of Jesus or these types of miracles. Not to say that there aren't miracles and wondrous healings, don't get me wrong, because there are. A young man named Luke comes to mind. But the reality is that most of us have encountered someone somewhere, perhaps someone close to us, who has experienced silence when petitioning God for a healing. And then right here before us, in the gospel today, we have this unnamed woman in the synagogue who doesn't ask for a healing, by the way. She just shows up with the rest of them, and with the wave of a hand, she is healed, made whole, restored, praising God as she leaves. There are many left waiting, hoping for that kind of response to their prayer. So let me ask you all a question. Were the others who showed up that day, were they healed? The text doesn't say. But if not, then healing to prove a point makes this story harder to reconcile, theologically in my mind, even as it serves to dramatize the fact that the old paradigms of sickness and infirmity meet their match in the words and deeds of Jesus. This is, in fact, the last time in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus will enter and teach in a synagogue. And from his first sermon till now, one thing is clear. Despite our challenge in reconciling one healing in the face of many others who needed it that day, Jesus does practice what he preaches. And you know that is good enough for a lot of people when it comes down to it. The great Frederick Buechner once wrote, "You do not need to understand healing to be healed, or to know anything about blessing to be blessed." At the risk of sounding too tongue-in-cheek here, I think what he meant by all of that was that if our pain doesn't destroy us, it might just transform us. But even then, such declarations come pretty close to sounding like two of the most beguiling myths that are out there. One, that everything happens for a reason. And two, that there is such a thing as redemptive suffering. I wonder at the fact that how easily folks forget that part in our funeral liturgy where we remember the fact that God does, and I quote, "not willingly afflict or grieve anyone." That seems pretty clear to me. Perhaps what isn't clear is the fact that there is a good chance that if we believe that the Paschal mystery has anything to do with our lives, that our suffering will ultimately be redeemed and has been through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ our Lord, versus the idea that God has a hand in that suffering, that the reason and purpose of our sickness, our crisis, or the violence that grips our world is because God has willed it, and that he has willed it to be redemptive for us, to be meaningful for us, to teach us a lesson. You see the difference there? Thanks for the head nods, because 8 o'clock was like, I don't know. And they call themselves the true believers. Yeah. What remains true? What remains true even in the face of suffering, my friends, is this cycle of dying and rising to new life. The Paschal mystery, which ultimately is the pattern of transformation, remains a mystery that is not logical or rational at all, but nonetheless is what we Christians believe is God's response to our suffering. I was reminded yesterday by a friend that we are all transformed through this pattern of death and rising, probably many times in our lifetime, and for some cosmic reason there seems to be no better crucible of growth and transformation than what we as Christians find meaning in. But even as we do so through faith, we have to be careful of that word meaning, especially when we toe any line that deals with suffering or the suffering of those we love. Because we all find great meaning in the things that make our life worth living, in the time that we have been given, in those who have been given to us to love in this life and to cherish. And when they suffer, it matters. It matters to us. And I hope that we all believe that it matters to God. Not in the sense that God caused that suffering in order to make sure we learn our place, but in the fact that God desires mercy and is compassionate and good, and that perhaps the most emphatic response to our suffering was in the suffering of his only begotten Son. I'm reminded of something that Richard Rohr once said when it comes to engaging this type of suffering, and that is that we would all prefer clear and easy answers. But it is in questions, especially in questions that surround and deal directly with suffering, that we are offered the greatest potential to experience an opening that will lead us to a transformation, not just in our own understanding of suffering, but our response to it as well. We will try, he says, to change events in order to avoid changing ourselves. But we must learn to stay with the pain of life, without answers, without conclusions, and some days without meaning. And that, my friends, is perhaps the hardest teaching of all. Anyone who says other than that to you is probably trying to sell you snake oil. And I think it's especially hard given the fact that ultimate surrender is not something that comes easy to anyone. St. Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas, two great doctors of the church, wrestled with this sense of meaninglessness when they affirmed that suffering and evil have, in fact, no meaning, in the sense that they do not exist except in terms of the violence they do to what has been created, that is, to what is good, God's creation, you. It's good, right? Genesis, just checking. This is all to reiterate that both of them believed that God has no part in causing suffering, and that if God has a hand in suffering, it was in his hand being nailed to the tree. In this, God does not give us an intellectual response to evil and suffering as we are wont to do. God gives us a human response, one born out of the great love we know as grace. And such grace will ultimately lead us to the state of emptiness in ourselves, if we let it, as we give all such love away. It will leave us in a momentary sense of meaninglessness ourselves, in which we, no doubt, will ask the humdinger of all questions. Why? May the spaciousness within that question fill you with a deep sense of love, my friends. Not fear or anger, because when all is said and done, God's response to suffering and death is life and life eternal in him who came not to condemn the world, but so that the world might be saved through him. And thus we have God's response to this story today in what Buechner referred to as transformation and in what Rohr referred to as the question. In true Jesus fashion, he responds to the leader of the synagogue, answering the question of whether or not it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath with a question of his own. Is not this a daughter of Abraham? At once restoring both her body and her dignity. Notice, my friends, that the cause of her suffering is not mentioned. It just is. Meaning that it has no meaning other than the fact that her suffering has afflicted her for 18 years, and that the folks who are there present are more interested on what day her appointment was supposed to be than on, in fact, what we can do, the least of what we can do in that moment, which is to guard the integrity of the afflicted. And perhaps that is why, of all the faces that mercy wears, dignity is perhaps the most becoming, and why Jesus' healings leave us always wanting more.